With that, I'll turn the call over to Luke Hanna. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Emily. And hello, good morning, and good afternoon to all of you, depending what time zone you are in. Welcome to the Annex 4 Environmental Research Webinar Series. This is the 7th Annex 4 Environmental Webinar, and the title of this is Adaptive Management in the Marine Renewable Energy Industry. As Emily mentioned, my name is Luke Hanna, and I'll be moderating the questions for today's webinar. So, as we all know, the marine renewable energy industry is a new and maturing industry, and there are still environmental uncertainties associated with deploying these wave and tidal energy technologies in the marine environment. Though adaptive management has several different definitions, it is a term typically used in natural resource management and refers to a management process that is focused on facilitating decision-making in the face of uncertainties. I should also add that there are several overarching principles of adaptive management, but I don't want to get into too many details here, and we'll let the presenters discuss these as they see fit. As described in the title, this webinar primarily focuses on how adaptive management and its principles can be and have been used as an effective decision-making process for the marine renewable energy industry. So we are joined today by three presenters. The first will be Kim Hatfield. She is a contractor with the National Marine Fisheries Service and has been working in natural resource management and consulting for private and public entities for 18 years. Before coming to NIMS, she worked as a consultant assisting clients with siting, permitting, constructing, and operating terrestrial wind, pipelines, recreation and resort facilities, and other large industrial projects. For the past 6 years, her primary focus has been on collaborative development and regulatory review of marine renewable energy projects in Oregon and Washington. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Kim Hatfield. Kim?
Thanks, Luke. Hope folks can hear me all right, and I'm happy to participate in today's discussion. As Luke mentioned, I work for National Marine Fisheries Service. I work for the West Coast region. I'm a contractor, and I work primarily in Oregon and Washington. So the focus of my talk today is on how we're using adaptive management in that arena specifically. I wanted to go ahead and move to the next slide. Today, I'd like to talk about a little bit about background on NIMS' regulatory role, our mission authorities, and why we're engaged in these processes, and how we use adaptive management. A brief overview of some of the principles as I feel they apply to marine energy, a little more specifics about that, and then a couple of project examples from our experience here on the West Coast. Next slide, please. National Marine Fisheries Service has an overarching mission of stewardship for living marine resources. In this, we are the lead federal agency tasked with protecting, restoring, managing living marine resources and their ecosystems. We use ecosystem management approaches to balance economic, social, environmental concerns, and we strive to integrate all concerns and priorities and use the best available science, including adaptive management, to achieve the mission of stewardship of marine resources. Next slide, please. As the stewards tasked with this protection and management of marine resources, we have a number of mandates and authorities that come from federal statutes and regulatory acts. Among these, of course, is the most familiar probably to folks is the Endangered Species Act. We also have a number of other acts, including Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act. We also work within the bounds of the National Environmental Policy Act and use the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act to further our stewardship of marine resources. Federal Power Act is one of the main mechanisms by which we engage in marine renewable energy project consideration and review. Federal Power Act is part of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's licensing. It kind of governs their licensing processes. And the reason that's important to consider the Federal Power Act is that it expands our consideration of resources to the whole marine environment of living resources and not just limiting us to Endangered Species Act, special protection species, critical habitat, and those types of designated resources. Excuse me. We get engaged in this process because of other federal entities, federal agencies actions such as the issuance of a license, a lease from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, funding from Department of Energy, or permitting from the Army Corps of Engineers. They have a regulatory responsibility to consult with us under the Endangered Species Act, and again, like I mentioned, the Federal Power has a different process that is required. To do all this, we work really closely with our federal partners, state and local agencies, tribal governments, and other stakeholders to engage together and develop science-based solutions to some of the complex ecological issues that face us with pretty much any development project in the marine environment, but particularly in marine renewable energy. And as I mentioned, we have identified adaptive management as a key tool, not only for natural resource management in a broad context, but very applicable to marine renewable energy actions, particularly to address, as Luke mentioned, the uncertainty and some of the complexity associated with this new growing industry. Next slide, please. This slide is very word-heavy, but it is directly from the Department of Interior's Adaptive Management Guide to for natural resources. And I want to kind of highlight a few particular aspects of how these general principles for natural resource management apply in our work with marine renewable energy. Again, NIMS management objective is the protection and conservation of marine resources, and we do use these natural resource adaptive management principles to address uncertainty. That first bullet highlights uncertainty regarding the management of natural resources. Well, there's been a lot of progress made in marine renewable energy, and a lot of information is starting to come in about not only the technology itself and the viability and effectiveness of the renewable energy, but also information regarding environmental effects. Although we've made some great strides, we are still lacking information, particularly when we consider projects at the site-specific and device-specific scale. To overcome this, we do tend to use surrogates, best available data from other industries and other types of projects in the marine environment. But that does still leave a gap of uncertainty about the particular and specific effects of a project in a specific site. The other key piece of uncertainty is looking forward towards kind of the non-direct or the indirect and cumulative potential effects of projects, because we don't have very much information about the long-term effects on habitat or on species as a whole. Direct effects are a little bit easier to consider because it's a direct interaction of a species or an individual with a particular device. Because the impacts are so uncertain and the stressor levels associated with projects are often uncertain when they come to us, it poses a challenge because we don't have enough available evidence to rely on in and of itself to make regulatory decisions. And that's where the development and consideration of an adaptive management process really helps us to move forward with our consideration of these projects. Because we rely on data and surrogate information from other types of projects, we often see a lot of modeling and predicted impacts. That's a key piece of an adaptive management process, but also a key piece of our consideration of effects, and leads us to the requirement for the next step in an adaptive management process, which would be monitoring, to monitor progress or to evaluate and confirm after installation of a project any predicted effects that were brought forth with modeling or from information from other sources such as oil and gas, for example. Monitoring allows for validation of models. It can confirm or negate our assumptions that we've drawn from another information source or a different industry, or from laboratory experiments, expanding them into the marine environment. Results from monitoring feed back into our decision-making processes in very specific ways. not just to trigger the need for, say, mitigative action, but also to feed back into our decision making to ensure that we got the information that we were looking for in our monitoring, to determine whether the results indicate an additional action is required, or if a modification to a project structure or an operational scheme is required. Does the monitoring can inform whether or not the project itself is operating within the bounds of what was predicted for a particular stressor. Can also inform whether or not we need to modify the monitoring method or frequency itself, and or do we need to reduce it? Have we learned enough? Are we at a point where we're comfortable with the information we have and what it's telling us about a particular interaction? Monitoring and adaptive management should also, or adaptive management itself should also consider non-project specific monitoring when you're moving through an adaptive management process. New information from other sources in this industry, from some of the deployments and facilities outside of the United States. It's really important for us to have in our adaptive management process a mechanism by which we consider and ensure that we're taking the best available science every time we revisit a particular plan. Moving on towards mitigation actions and evaluations, the results of a monitoring plan or a monitoring effort may indicate that some particular preset threshold was surpassed, and thus a particular monitoring result may require or trigger a mitigative action. Once we've taken a mitigative action, we want to be able to go back out and evaluate and ensure that that mitigative action was actually successful in either reducing or modifying the level of effect. Therefore, that's another piece of that feedback loop. Of course, all of this effort and adaptive management cycle requires a lot of agreement and commitment. It's a kind of a less tangible piece of the process, but it really is the linchpin to look at the commitment of all parties and the resources available from all parties to ensure that this is a successful endeavor in the long term. As we've seen so far in the marine renewable energy, we can make great strides, but it also is taking quite a bit of time for us to gather the information and build the evidence base for our understanding and addressing uncertainty associated with these projects. To date, we've been on the West Coast. We've had a number of projects that have moved forward, and NIMS has committed resources not only on the planning side, but on the implementation side for a number of projects in the wave energy environment and tidal energy environment. I kind of want to touch on a couple of those. Next slide, please. The first one I wanted to talk about, they're both FERC licensed projects, but the first one I wanted to talk about was kind of the first project out of the gate in about 2005, or Ocean Power Technologies proposed the Reedsport OPT wave park off the coast of Oregon, near Reedsport, Oregon. The project itself was designated and went through the Oregon Solutions process, which was a process designed and designated by the governor to allow and define and ensure broad stakeholder engagement in the regulatory process, which was as a result of previous experiences of the state in the ocean energy development arena. The project itself, the way it was proposed, was a phased or adaptive approach. A single buoy was intended to be put out, and we would learn some lessons and gather some environmental data from that, and then forward if things, were within acceptable parameters to a 10-buoy deployment. The folks that developed this, I was not at the table for the development of this process, but have been working on or did work on the carrying out of the adaptive management process for this. There was a long multi-year process. I know people spent a lot of time and committed a lot of energy and resources to the development of a settlement agreement, which included as the cornerstone adaptive management monitoring and mitigation for this project. Some of the key benefits or really well-done pieces of this adaptive management process for the OPT was that because of the long-term engagement and the commitment to a settlement agreement, there was a high degree of stakeholder buy-in. They developed a very, very detailed, really integrated flow chart which identified how new information would be considered, how thresholds would be set, how monitoring and mitigation would be achieved, when decision points were required, and how to resolve disputes. They managed to get that all into one amazing flow chart, which is very complicated but was very helpful coming in after the development of this process. It was very helpful for new folks around the table to understand what the intent was with the adaptive management process. And I think that's a key piece to think about when we're developing these plans is not only how does it serve us for today, but how will future people around the table be able to carry out and or, as necessary, modify these processes. The other couple benefits about the OPT process and the OPT framework, they did a really good job of outlining intervals at which there would be specific check-ins, intervals at which monitoring would occur, identifying key issues of concern and how they would be addressed. And they did have some really well-defined time periods for achievement or milestones. One thing to keep in mind when developing these type of detailed plans is to ensure that there's also a easy and clean process for modifying plans. That is, we don't want to make the modification or flexibility in the plan a challenge within itself. And I think that the phased approach to the project itself, which is really kind of an inherent adaptive management approach, was really beneficial and useful and something that we should endeavor to incorporate into future projects as they move forward. That phased approach really helps to identify and or alleviate concerns, provide detailed information that's necessary for appropriate effects evaluations, and also gives us a learning opportunity to modify and improve our processes. Next slide, please. The other project I wanted to touch briefly on today as a more of a planning example is the Tidal energy development. It was a pilot project in Admiralty Inlet, which is a part of Puget Sound in Washington. It's a highly urbanized area, but it is also a very diverse and rich ecosystem with a number of not only just significant marine resources, but we have some high-profile and very beloved species that are listed that are present and iconic in the area. In about 2007, Snohomish County PUD, Public Utility Department, began their pursuit of a pilot license for 2 tidal turbines to be deployed in Admiralty Inlet. Purpose of the project was to learn more about the performance of these tidal turbines, but also to address or identify and investigate any potential environmental impacts from this project. Although it was a pilot project, and they did, the folks around the table, we spent a number of years identifying issues and developing specific monitoring and mitigation to address environmental concerns. The one key thing that was done really well in this particular project was not only planning for the inclusion of new information after the project was in the water, but adapting and modifying the actual plans during development process in light of new information that was gained from both baseline monitoring efforts and other information that was coming from deployments. There were a lot of modifications and in the development of the monitoring plans for this project based on experience and new information as it came in. They did a really good job of responding to those needs and identifying what was what they thought was going to work but didn't, incorporating that new information in and making sure that the plan itself was something that would provide the information necessary but also be something that was reasonable to carry out. I think one of the other benefits and really good aspects of this particular plan was that the mitigation and monitoring plans and issues identification were very, very clearly defined, gave some certainty not only to regulators to have certainty that environmental effects would be, within the bounds of what was considered, but also gave Snohomish PD a good idea of what the expectations were for their project and their responsibilities for environmental monitoring and mitigation on the back end. I think they also did a really good job of streamlining the actual plan as far as the framework that was required. And they were able to incorporate lessons learned and identify what was really reasonable for the project moving forward. The unfortunate thing with this particular Washington project and the Oregon project that I've discussed is that at this point neither one of them is moving forward. So our on-the-ground experience in adaptive management is a bit more limited to some other ongoing projects. But I do have a few key points about adaptive management and marine energy that I just wanted to circle back and highlight. So next slide, please. A couple of key considerations or key thoughts from my experience in adaptive management for marine energy. There is general information out there, not only about adaptive management, but about the potential environmental effects. A lot of time and effort has gone into developing and identifying potential environmental concerns and the level of risk associated with those. But it does take time and resources to bring that high-level information down to a project and site-specific plan. Adaptive management plans just cannot be carried out unless they are tailored to a specific project and a specific site. I think one of the strengths of adaptive management is it does provide us the opportunity to move forward in the face of uncertainty. We are afforded the opportunity to set boundaries and limitations on the potential environmental effects by using an adaptive management feedback process in which we incorporate monitoring and mitigation measures. That really provides the flexibility needed to get projects in the water, but also provides the certainty needed for both sides to be able to have confidence in moving forward. I think the adaptive management in marine energy definitely is building and improving knowledge base for future projects in other locations, but also for expanded build-out of projects within a particular site. A couple of key considerations for agencies, stakeholders, and developers are the fact that this type of a process requires a long-term commitment of resources, requires really strong relationships and clear communication, and problem solving, and a commitment to solutions in the face of the uncertainty that we face. Overall, I think a logical approach definitely suggests that a phased, pragmatic approach to development and adaptive management, to detect possible impacts and mitigation to respond to those impacts in an incremental fashion helps to address any potential irrevocable or irreversible adverse outcomes. I think it's an incredibly valuable tool that we use regularly here on the West Coast, and will continue to do so. And I hope my sharing of information has been informative. A couple of things when Luke and I were talking about this particular presentation, he raised a couple of interesting questions. So let's go to the next slide, please. There were a couple of thoughts about, I think, that are important for the whole group to think about as we listen to the next couple of presenters, and maybe we'll spur some discussion. One thought is about how adaptive management is changing, and my brief view on that is that I don't necessarily see that adaptive management, which is a long-standing concept, is changing in process necessarily, but I do think it is changing how we are able to consider and move forward with these projects. I think it has provided us an avenue to work together to find solutions to some of these complex environmental considerations that come with marine renewable energy. And then the other question that Luke raised was, what is adaptive management doing for the industry? I can only give you my small world regulators experience. I don't sit on the industry side of the table, but as we all are stakeholders engaged in this process moving forward, I do see that we're improving our ability to address and understand the uncertainty. We're improving our ability to work together and identify key concerns and reasonable solutions to addressing them. I think that we are improving in our ability to develop specific monitoring plans and mitigative actions. And I think that this is the tool by which we are going to continue to improve and see more projects in deployment in the United States. I want to thank everyone for their time. My last slide, I think, is just my contact information. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about adaptive management. It's a key tool for me in my work with National Marine Fisheries Service, and thanks so much for the time.
Great, thank you so much, Kim. That was fantastic. If you can please go back to the previous slide. So don't have any questions quite yet. I think the audience is probably still getting a little warmed up. But I just want to reiterate Kim's comments on these two questions and just encourage the audience to really kind of focus on these questions as we go through this webinar, because it's important to think about these, and adaptive management is extremely pertinent concept to marine renewable energy. And so, again, I'd like to just encourage the audience to think about these questions as we move forward. So I'm not seeing any other questions come in at the moment. So maybe what we should do is move on to the next presenter, and hopefully we'll get some more feedback as we progress through the webinar. So our next presenter is Nathan Johnson from ORPC. So Nathan is the Director of Environmental Affairs and Director of Business Development in ORPC Solutions. He directs ORPC's site licensing and permitting efforts, leveraging local and global relationships to develop innovative approaches to marine hydrokinetic permitting and environmental monitoring. He also leads business development efforts for ORPC Solutions, the strategic advisory services arm of ORPC. He's a native Maine Islander and has a diverse background in commercial fishing, construction management, and environmental engineering. He serves on the boards of the Island Institute and the Maine Ocean and Wind Institute Initiative and the Policy Advisory Committee for the Maine Sea Grant. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Nathan.
Great. Can you hear me all right, Luke?
I can. Loud and clear.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thanks everybody for taking part of their day to listen to this webinar. I noticed there's a lot of familiar participants in the box, so hope everybody's doing well. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about ORPC's approach to adaptive management and how we've been successful implementing that process. So next slide, please. A little bit of brief background on ORPC. We are a developer of tidal energy technology. I should also say tidal, ocean current, and river technology, as well as projects, founded in 2004. We're headquartered in Portland, Maine in the U.S. With affiliate offices in Alaska, Quebec, and Ireland. We have numerous technology and research partners, which have been a big part of our experience and success, which includes the U.S. National Laboratories and also a number of academic institutions. We have designed and tested and deployed in-water deployments 5 generations of technology, and delivered power to shore from the Tidal project in Maine, as well as a river hydrokinetic project in Alaska. We've been very successful on the project development side of things, navigating the regulatory and environmental pathways and challenges, and also place a very high level of importance on our community engagement and working with the local communities and developing local economic development benefits. And lastly, as part of our success, we have had others in the industry come to us and looking for our experience to leverage on other projects. And so we, several years ago, launched a subsidiary called ORPT Solutions to provide those services to the broader industry. Next slide, please. Just briefly, ORPT Power Systems, we have a cross-flow turbine technology, horizontal access technology. The core components, the generator and the turbines themselves, we refer to as the TGU, the turbine generator unit. And that TGU is more or less the same across platforms, which allows us to leverage a lot of the engineering as well as some of the environmental interactions across platforms. So in the top picture is our Tidal device, which is about 30 meters in length. It was installed in Cobson Bay in eastern Maine on the border with Canada in 2012. And we also have a number of other prototypes and power systems that we have deployed. In 2014, we tested a prototype of the same technology using a tension leg mooring platform and a buoyancy pod that got rid of some of the foundation requirements that we dealt with Tidal, and we'll talk a bit more about that in the case study. And then in 2014 and 2015, we deployed our RibGen turbine in a remote community in Alaska. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. That is on what we call our pontoon support structure, which is the ballasted system of submerging and raising the device without the use of fixed foundations. Excellent. So on the environmental side and the regulatory side, one of the key challenges industry-wide is really trying to balance the risk and the proportionality of the environmental monitoring with the actual perceived risk or measured risk from a project. And that is an incredibly difficult thing to do. When we were starting, and I think it's still really the case today, although we're making advances, there was no best available science available, so we and others in the industry kind of had to develop that process as we go. And so for us, adaptive management is a tool to achieve that, to really try to have a mechanism that can be learned from what we gather and make really informed decisions on what the appropriate level of monitoring is. For investors and regulators, there's different challenges. As Kim talked about in her presentation, they're mandated by a number of different acts in the U.S., whether it's the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Magnuson-Stevens, and others, and they have the other demands on them as well. And in the public, obviously, there's a key component to risk from public perception as well. So it's really trying to find where all these interests are divergent and where they're aligned, and have a mechanism to move forward and in the project where everybody's able to accept some of that risk. So we, as a company, have spent a lot of time developing an approach to adaptive management that really has some key fundamentals to it. And as I said, we feel that we've been very successful with this. And it really involves some really early discussions in the project, and when you're talking with communities, regulatory stakeholders, and then building and maintaining regulatory trust. And that's not something that can be done overnight. It really is a combination of frequent and open communication with the regulators, understanding the demands that they have in terms of what they're mandated to do, but also other projects that they're involved with. On our part, it's really submitting informed and detailed project applications, and also delivering on our commitments, which is a big one. So that is really a key component. Also utilizing science-based data collection. As I said before, when we started this process, there really was very little best available science. So not only were we developing the methodologies, but also the technologies to really have science-based data that we could be confident in, and the regulators could be confident in. And I said it before, engaging the community and really starting early in the process is really fundamental to our success. In regards to the science-based data collection as well, we have teamed with a number of really key technical advisors, which include the University of Maine and the School of Marine Sciences, and also Dr. Gil Zidlewski from the New England Aquarium, Dr. Mo Brown from the New England Aquarium, and Dr. Brandon Southall on marine mammal issues. So they have been key in gathering that data and developing the methodologies to collect key data. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, we deployed our Tidal device in Comstock Bay in Maine in 2012. That was following Federal Energy Regulatory Commission license issuance in early of 2012. And part of that license issuance, there's a number of license articles that are required to be adhered to, and one of which includes the development of an adaptive management plan within 3 months of license issuance. So we started that process early on. We went back to the regulators and our technical advisors that we've been working with already to get their feedback on what that plan would actually look like. And the response we got from them was that the process that we had been developing all along as we led up to the FERC license application is the one that they felt was very suitable moving forward. And so it was very easy to move or transition from the application phase to the actual compliance phase of the project because it was a continuation of the same process that we used. And so we developed a plan that was based on, guidance out there in the industry, and also bringing together those regulators that we've been working with already, which include NOAA, NIMS, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and then on a state level, the Maine Department of Environmental Protection and the Maine Department of Marine Resources. And the adaptive management team also includes the technical advisors that had been with the project very early on and had been working with the regulators and ORPC to develop the monitoring plans. So that happened in early 2012, and we had a workshop near our project site in Reedsport, Maine, where we invited everybody together, really refine that, refine that process and finalize the plan in July. So I want to move into a case study that kind of talks a little bit more detail about how this process works for us. So next slide, please. A couple key dates, which I already mentioned. Our FERC pilot license for the Comstock Bay project was issued on February 27th of 2012. And one of the other license articles that was part of that project is that all pile driving activities had to be completed before April 9th, which is a very short time frame, doing an installation technique that really had not been done before. So it was a huge challenge for us. And the key issue there is the presence of Atlantic salmon smolt in the region. And so this was a very challenging deadline to meet. We also had, as part of the pile driving plans, we had applied for and been issued an incidental harassment authorization from NOAA for marine mammals. So the key challenge here was how are we going to install 10 30-inch steel piles in 30 meters of water in a very challenging time of year on the state of Maine from a weather perspective, and also in an environment where we only have basically a 30-minute slack water window to do any activities. So very daunting, and we started to we had plans in place and started discussion with the regulators about the applicability of this deadline. And just briefly on these couple pictures, the top picture on the right is our bottom support crane being deployed to the seabed, which was on March 20th of 2012. and it was a record-setting warmth that day. It was close to 80 degrees. The lower picture is actually the impact hammer being raised several days later to drive a pile, and that's not fog, it's actually snow. So it's March, April, and May are very, very challenging times to do weather related to weather. So it was something that we didn't take lightly at all. Next slide, please. So how we executed this process is that we built off the monitoring plans that we'd already developed, which included taking hydroacoustic and in-air acoustic measurements. The hydroacoustic measurements were gathered by what we call a drifting noise measurement system that was developed for the project, which is a passive acoustic system. And we also did marine mammal observations and mitigation and sea and shorebird surveys to try to quantify the impacts of pile driving. We engaged FERC early on in this process to determine whether they'd be willing to modify the license based on the data that we collected. Very early on, after we had driven several piles using both an impact and a vibratory hammer, and using mitigation measures that included marine mammal observers and sound absorption cushions, among other things, we were able to prove that the sound exposure levels and the peak levels generated from the activities were below the threshold, which could cause injury to salmon smolt. As a result of that process, we requested a license modification from FERC to extend that window for which we could do pile driving activities. Next slide, please. So the results were that by using these methods that we had worked with our technical advisors and worked with the regulators on, we were able to collect the data that satisfied that group and get their concurrence to a license modification request to FERC, which was granted on April 4th, which was only several weeks after we had deployed the bottom support frame. Ironically, that's the same day that we completed pile driving. So we didn't need that extension, but what it really demonstrated that the approach was very effective in using that process to make modifications to our license, which ultimately will result in less effort and less cost. It also established best management practices for future installations using similar technologies. I'll caveat that by saying that our next generation technologies we're looking at moving away from pile driving, but it certainly demonstrated that that type of activity can be completed in a timely manner and with mitigation measures can have minimal impact on the environment. Next slide, please. This slide has a lot of information on it, but what I want to convey here is that same process that we used, even though the pile driving example was kind of an extraordinary circumstance in terms of the timing and the deadline. It's the same process we use moving forward by getting concurrence to the adaptive management team and submitting that concurrence in a license modification request to FERC to modify our license articles. And so when we were operating in 2012 and early in 2013, we were able to collect a lot of data around our different study plans, which included acoustics, benthic and biofouling, fishery and marine life interaction, hydraulics, marine mammals, and birds. And a number of those we were able to demonstrate had very little risk, and we were able to lower the frequency and some of the methodologies that were involved in those monitoring plans. So that was very effective moving forward. The process that we felt was really validated, and we were able to reduce costs and effort associated with that. Our Tidal device was removed in the middle of 2013, and with further funding from the U.S. Department of Energy and others to go to the next generation of that technology. So the same process that we use with the adaptive management team, we moved into another phase where we are we have got their concurrence on being in a temporary variance from environmental monitoring. But the adaptive management team has a strong interest in our other activities, which I'm going to talk about as well, and we meet on an annual basis to bring the best and the newest knowledge of those to them. So as we move forward ultimately with the Cobsuit Bay project and other projects in Maine, they'll be very informed of the latest information. Next slide, please. So as I said, we've moved into a transitional phase for the Cobsuit Bay Tidal Energy project, but there's still been a lot of work going on. Our partners at the University of Maine School of Marine Science have been continuing to do data analysis on the data that was collected when we were deployed, so that includes both down-looking hydroacoustics as well as side-looking hydroacoustics around our device to determine fish densities and impacts of the turbine, and also fish movement around the turbines. And so this slide, and I think this will be available after the fact, lists a number of studies that University of Maine is doing and that were published in last year. One of them is still in progress that really provide further insight into the distribution and movement of fish around our device. Next slide, please. Again, these are a couple other studies that the University of Maine continues to work on, and one that was recently published in regards to what the probability of a fish encounter is, and the distance above the bottom, or where the turbine is sited vertically in the water column, certainly has an influence on that, and so that's something, again, that we're continuing to learn from. And in Western Passage, which is an adjacent site in the Eastport area, we feel there's a very good commercial build-out opportunity, and the University of Maine is continuing to do some analysis on some of the larger species that have been present in down-looking acoustics, including porpoises and the shark. Next slide, please. One of the other projects that we've been very involved with lately is our RibGen project in Igiagi, Alaska, which is about 240 miles southwest of Anchorage, and this is located on the Kvichak River, which is one of the most prolific salmon migratory runs in North America. We deployed there in 2014 and also this past year. This past year we deployed a little bit earlier in the year, and I'll talk about some of the results. There are a number of state and federal permits that were required for this project, and we were installed from July through September in partnership with the local Igiagi Village Council. Next slide. So the project in Igiagi was really an amazing opportunity from an environmental interaction standpoint for not only for us but for the industry. As I said, it's one of the preeminent salmon migratory runs in North America, and it's also very, very well studied. This top graph shows the mean number of fish by the calendar date over the last 5 years. Last year in 2014, it was a historically high amount run, and this year it was historically high and late, which allowed us to really get a lot of interaction data, both with adult sockeye salmon, but also sockeye salmon smolt and other smolt. So in the first several weeks that we were deployed, nearly 2 million adult sockeye passed through the stretch of the river for us, which was a terrific opportunity. There was no evidence of passage delay. There was no evidence of attraction, and there was no evidence of injury or mortality. So this was a terrific data set that we're continuing to process and learn a lot about, but it really has validated a lot of our approaches. We implemented an adaptive management approach to this project as well, where we worked with state officials on notifying them of any interactions that were seen and making decisions. And during the course of the project, it was not determined that any mitigation measures were necessary. The vast majority of the fish passed by on the banks and didn't directly interact. The ones that did interact, which from video coverage was in the range of 700 fish or so, again, there was no evidence of injury or mortality. Next slide, please. So the next steps, our adaptive management team for the Cobsuit Bay project has been extremely interested in Igiagi. We presented those results at our last adaptive management team in November. There's still a huge data set that was collected in IGIAG that hasn't been analyzed, and the U.S. Department of Energy has funded the Pacific Northwest National Lab to conduct further analysis and also to develop automation tools for the data collection system. I know there's a few folks from PNNL on the call, so we're looking forward to working with them on that and think there will be some pretty significant outcome as well. And then there was also the IGIAG Village Council was recently selected for further DOE money for working with us to really increase durability and availability for future installations, and that includes characterization of both ice presence and also sand and smoke. So we're looking forward to continue to build that knowledge base. Next slide, please. So all these elements that we've been through are really trying to get at the key balancing of proportionality of monitoring to risk, and we've been very successful in that. And another key component is building that knowledge base so that we can have very informed discussions with regulatory officials and make prudent decisions on what that appropriate level is. As we get closer to commercial operations and deployment of arrays, it becomes even more important to retire risk around single devices so we can get them in the water and then try to analyze how the arrays have effects to the environment. And the process that we developed in Maine, we're certainly leveraging for projects in Alaska and elsewhere, and we feel it's been very successful. So, in conclusion, for us, adaptive management has really been a tool that we can collaborate with stakeholders and develop that proportionality and that responsible approach to environmental monitoring. And we feel moving forward that it will be a process that will further allow us to reduce and retire risk and reduce efforts and costs to a reasonable approach. We've also seen that this approach of building this knowledge base has been very effective as we move to permitting and licensing future projects, and that more informed approach has significantly reduced costs on our most recent draft pilot license application to FERC, which is, moving things in the right direction for sure. And then finally, it does create that path to transition projects from pilot to commercial scale and getting devices in the water, which is so important. So hopefully we have some time for questions. I, again, appreciate everybody's involvement and forward to speaking to everybody soon. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Nate. That was excellent. We do have a couple questions. Some of them I may hold to the end, but I think we could definitely ask a couple now. So, Nate, you mentioned you had freedom to adapt your device installation operation process for the Coppice Bay project. Was this built into your adaptive management plan, or does this modification have to come from formal requests from regulators?
Can you say that again, Lou?
So you mentioned you had freedom to adapt your device installation operation process for the Coppice Bay project. Was this built into your plan, or did the modifications have to come from formal requests from regulators?
It was actually both. So we developed a plan, and the plan is actually publicly available. So it has a mechanisms and approach to how decisions are made and how the license is modified. So it certainly has been an evolving process, but it is structured in a way in our plan. But then what we do when we make a request is we meet with the adaptive management team and get their concurrence on that request before submitting it to FERC, which we've seen in our experience that FERC is very responsive to those requests if they see the concurrence of the adaptive management team.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. This question came right after Kim's as we were introducing Nate, and so Kim, this might be for you, but it also could be Nate if you want to provide an answer, as well as Finley too. You feel free to jump in here. Some government regulators tend to be slightly risk averse and may balk at uncertainty. How do you suggest providing government regulators with comfort in proceeding with adaptive management procedures?
Yeah, I'll attempt to field that, and maybe Nate or Finley can. I think that sorry, can you guys hear me? I think that the key is working together and spending the time to develop an adaptive management process and monitoring and mitigation process that addresses not only the needs of the developer but of regulators. And I think that the more often that we share information about how we're doing that and offer ourselves as resources, those of us who have done this, a couple times, it can assist in areas where maybe the level of understanding and comfort with how this really could work in a regulatory process. And by this I mean adaptive management. I can help alleviate some of that risk averse. By our nature, regulators, we have some requirements that we are tasked with meeting. So, the risk averse is not just a kind of a personal thing, but it's a regulatory requirement in some environments. And adaptive management is really the tool by which we can kind of get over some of those uncertainty hurdles, at least in my opinion. So.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Kim. I mean, it really comes down to trust and building that trust through open communication and, having a process that both developers and regulators are involved with from the very beginning, and having, trust in the science as well, not only the science but the process, and all those things together, I think, provide the basis for an adaptive management approach.
Great. Thank you both. Finley, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I'll just say that regulators ultimately have the job of making decisions, and anyone who makes decisions knows that there are risks associated with the decisions they make. So regulators should want to understand what those risks are, and they should be comfortable with them. I think there's no doubt that environmental assessments are becoming increasingly quantitative in their approach. They're increasingly reliant on mechanistic modeling of effects, and regulators need to be comfortable with the numbers that come out of these models and how they make decisions in light of these numbers. And that's really about, that to me is an open door to adaptive management approaches. It really, and I think this is really why we're having a webinar today, because of the active interest amongst the regulatory community around the world and what opportunities adaptive management approaches can provide for them in managing the risks that they have.
Right, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So we have a couple other questions, but I think I might save them until the end. And that was just Finley Bennett with Marine Scotland Science speaking, and so he will be our final presenter for today. And so Finley is a scientific advisor working at Marine Scotland Science based in Aberdeen. His work is focused on assessment impacts of marine renewables on species and habitats of conservation importance. Finley is also the UK representative to the WREN initiative and is chair of the IC's working group on marine renewable energy. And so with that, Finley, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Luke. So yeah, the organisation I work for is Marine Scotland Science, and that's part of Marine Scotland, which in turn is part of the Scottish Government. So I have colleagues in Marine Scotland who are responsible for the licensing process used for marine renewable energy projects. And as Luke said, my own work is concerned with the scientific assessment of the impacts of marine renewable energy. So today I've been asked to talk about a policy that's given the title Survey, Deploy and Monitor, or I might start calling it the SDN policy or SDN. So in practice, the policy helps to rationalise those situations or scenarios where the Scottish Government is willing to make a determination on an application for consent by a renewable energy developer on the basis of 1 year pre-consent site characterisation survey. And that's it. That's all it does. It's a very simple policy. And I can imagine some of you might now be wondering why it's not called something like the one-year pre-consent site characterization survey policy, which, if you are wondering that, is something I've sometimes wondered about as well. But to avoid any confusion, I thought I'd make that abundantly clear at the outset. And of course, today's webinar is all about adaptive management, and I'll get on to more of that later. But in terms of what I take that phrase to mean, I'll refer you to some of the previous presentations, in particular the Department of Interior's Adaptive Management Technical Guide. Although I'd add that in researching the background to adaptive management, I was looking at the seminal textbook on environmental assessment and adaptive management by Holling and his group at the University of British Columbia, and I couldn't help noting that one of the co-authors, and indeed the only one from Western Europe, was someone called John Steele, who worked at the Marine Lab where I'm sitting at the moment. So it's a bit curious that 40 years after he was sitting here thinking about what this concept was, I find myself talking to a webinar about adaptive management, which isn't actually a term which is in everyday use within the regulatory community in the UK. So next slide, please. Next slide.
Sorry.
All right, there we go.
There seems to be a delay.
So this is what I'll try and cover. Firstly, why did the Scottish Government develop the policy until allow one-year site characterisation survey before making a decision on projects? What exactly is the policy? There's a bit more to it than what I've already told you. Thirdly, what's the latest thinking on the policy itself, and how might it change in the future? And finally, where does the SDM policy sit in the context of adaptive management? So next slide, please. And so this slide is about really the context for why the SDM policy became so focused on the issue of one-year pre-consent site characterisation survey. And we need to step back in time to the end of the last decade, so about 6 or 7 years ago. This is a slightly personal perspective because I wasn't working in Marine Scotland Science at the time, but the goal of the Scottish Government was to be able to provide, or still is to be able to provide 100% of its electricity demand from renewable energy sources, and to do that by 2020. So it's obviously a highly ambitious goal it set itself, and development in the marine environment was seen as necessary to meet that target. Scotland was considered to have huge natural potential for generating wave and tidal power, as well as offshore wind power. In 2010, virtually none of that potential had been realised in any way, and so we were dealing with new technologies that weren't commercially proven. The Scottish Government was working with a whole plethora of new, relatively small companies that often didn't have a lot of money. So how best to transition from this situation of having virtually nothing to having mature industries in such a short time scale? So the focus was principally on the wave and tidal industries. And if you sit back and think about where the situation we're in today, things have changed a lot in a short time. So today the tidal sector is rapidly becoming established on a commercial scale in Scotland, with the Maygen project in particular. But wave aspirations for wave generation have probably taken a step backwards, in all honesty, with companies like Polaris have gone bust in the last year or so. But also, scientific uncertainty was obviously going to be an issue with regard to impact assessments. And the approach generally taken in the UK is to do precautionary or conservative modelling of the effect pathways, such as the collision risk or the effects of displacement or the barrier effects on mobile animals. And it was recognised early on that because of the precautionary approach, the lack of empirical data, this assessment process could act as a constraint for development. Next slide, please. So policy considerations became particularly focused on EIA, environmental impact assessment issues. Of course, an environmental impact assessment is needed to inform most project proposals, and the Scottish Government obviously has a large amount of experience of regulating developments that produce renewable energy and require environmental impact assessment, as do their statutory advisors, Scottish Natural Heritage. We've got all the terrestrial wind projects, and we have hydropower, for example. And many other types of major development all have established standard protocols for how much site characterization survey is required by the process, and it's generally to undertake 2 years of survey. So concerns were raised about the need for 2-year survey, concerns about the high costs of these surveys in the marine environment, which was considered disproportionate, especially given the small scale of some of the projects. Concern also about the meaningfulness of some of the standard surveys in the context of highly mobile species, the design-based approaches, and whether they were really as informative as was appropriate. So there was acknowledgement that the primary purpose of these surveys was to inform decision-making about the acceptability of project proposals, and I'm making that distinction between creating a baseline for decision-making and post-consent monitoring, which is likely to ask different questions, often questions which have been driven or come out of the environmental assessment itself, and might be, quite more a good deal bit more specific. So it's important to bear in mind that the post-consent monitoring questions are likely to be different and require their own, bespoke survey designs. Next slide, please. So SNH produced some guidelines, and I've provided a link at the end of the talk to those guidelines, but they remain draft to this day despite being about 6 years old, because of some of the challenging issues around producing standard advice on what sort of site characterization survey approaches are the most appropriate. And so there was this policy debate really, and whatever your prior views, they have to sit on a spectrum, and at one end of that spectrum will be those people who will be proponents of what I'm choosing to call a drippy approach, so data-rich but information poor. And I guess those people would want to understand all the natural variation associated with the system before any decision was made. And they'd have to acknowledge, if you wanted to go down that route, that you could be creating or gathering data for many, many years indeed, possibly decades. And we've got trends in the populations of many of our species. And there'd be very large costs associated. And of course, after gathering all that information, would you really be that much better informed in making your decision? How do you make your decision with all this data? On the other end of the spectrum, there were those people who would argue that doing pre-consent survey is a complete waste of time. Using new technologies, the scientific basis for assuming impacts are still putative. There are no means of knowing whether or not these hypothetical effects actually occur in reality. You just need to put the devices in the water and see what happens. And if you're a proponent of that approach, you'd have to acknowledge that there would be risks involved in doing that our understanding of the marine environment is incomplete, and we may, by adopting such an approach, go to some locations that were relatively risky. However, a consensus emerged from the discussions that it may not always be appropriate to require 2 years baseline surveys before giving consent to a project. So the next slide, please. So really, out of this debate, the SDN policy became focused on the rationalising an approach that would allow the regulator to justify making a decision based on only 1 year pre-consent site characterization survey. And it's really a risk-based approach that looked at 3 different aspects of risk and developed a scoring system for each aspect with the ultimate objective of deciding whether or not a given project in a given location of a given technology was sufficiently low risk to move forward to determining the suitability of the project with fewer data collection from the project's proponent itself. So those are the 3 aspects of risk that were considered under the policy: environmental sensitivity, device technology risk, and project scale. So a little bit in each of those. The next slide, please. It was also recognized at the outset that there was going to be real value in trying to retain expert opinion in whatever decision-making process was adopted. So there are various opportunities for doing that within the assessment process. Excuse me. So first of all, environmental sensitivity mapping was done, and this is really very similar to what, if any of you are familiar with strategic environmental assessment work, it was really very similar to that sort of assessment, with a scoring of the sensitivity of the environmental features. I don't really have time to go into the details of how the scoring system worked, but it made use of existing long-term data sets that Scottish Government had access to, and it was carried out at a relatively large spatial scale, as you can see from the map. And it involved weighting and scoring sensitivities like protected areas, protected seabird colonies, and maps that we had on the abundance and distribution of seabirds during different seasons, and similar data for marine mammals and some fish species as well. So, the outcome was that for any location, the relative environmental sensitivity could be scored. So, next slide, please. And this slide is covering the device technology risk analysis, which was also scored. And this really involved looking at the hypothetical pathways of effect and the potential seriousness of their consequences in terms of impact. And of course, individual devices have multiple pathways of effect, some more serious than others in terms of potential impact. So, the examples I've given, if you imagine the risks associated with an animal colliding with those devices, probably the risks are greater with one of those devices compared to the other. So expert opinion was applied within the framework of a formal scoring process, again, to come up with an overall technology risk. Next slide, please. And finally, project scale was considered, and that was undertaken in really quite a simple way of how many megawatts was the project proposing to be able to produce, and categorizing it as low, medium, high. So having come up with scores of low, medium, and high for each of environmental risk, device risk, and project scale, those could all be combined together to come up with an overall risk score. And if the project was sufficiently low risk, it qualified under the SDN policy, and the proponent of the project was only required to gather 1 year pre-consent site survey data. So a couple of examples, just to give you a flavour of how the policy has been applied. First one is a contour rotating turbine, a company called Nautricity. As an example, just where the project is low scale, it is considered low risk overall, and it's gone forward and has been consented by the Scottish Government in a relatively low risk location on the basis of 1 year's information gathered by the developer. And at the opposite end of this spectrum, the tidal turbine industry is now moving rapidly towards a commercial scale development, and is really running ahead of the development, I'd say, of the FDN policy. And so projects like Maygen have sought consent for, quite large-scale, relatively large-scale projects that could be considered high risk under the policy. And so the consequence for them is that they're currently being phased, and the first phase of the Maygen project, which is, I believe, going to be deployed this year, is about 4 turbines, I understand, and as part of that first phase will be intensive monitoring of a whole range of environmental receptors. But one of the key constraints that the tidal turbine industry is concerned about generally is collision risk, and so understanding harbour seal collision risk is likely to be important for informing future build-outs. And just to give you a slightly different, I mentioned that expert opinion is as the process has tried to retain that. So in this example, it's floating wind, which is a proposal for 5 devices relatively close to where I'm speaking in Aberdeen. It's considered, I think, medium risk if you applied the criteria of the policy. It was agreed after some discussion to go ahead with 1-year site surveys and to review the situation at the end of that year. And it was found that there was a real spike in OC numbers, so common mure and razorbill, after the molting period, so they were perceived to be potentially quite sensitive because they couldn't fly, they were just moving away from the breeding colonies and going further out to sea. So a decision was made that we needed more than 1 year's site characterization survey, but it could be limited to that key period. So a further second-year survey information was gathered, but only during a relatively short period of the year. And that project has subsequently been granted consent by the Scottish Government. So other people are thinking about exactly this sort of issue, how much site characterization survey is required for regulators to make decisions. And most recent example I'm aware is this work by Natural Resources Wales, who provide advice to the Welsh Government in the UK. And they've produced this advice on guidance for marine mammals and tidal stream energy sites in Wales. And they're advocating adopting an even more flexible approach than a regulator stipulating 1-year pre-consent survey. And they point out that there are certain examples where using your baseline understanding of the risk, you will be able to demonstrate that there's such a low likelihood that the effects will exceed the acceptable thresholds. There is really no utility in undertaking additional survey. And so we can see that the policy development in that regard. Next slide, please. And I also thought it was worth mentioning the RICOR project. The RICOR project is really based around the approach adopted by the Survey, Deploy, Monitor policy. It's a European-wide project. Partners are from Ireland, Portugal, Spain, France, and Scotland. And it's really about looking at how applicable the SDM policy might be in these other countries. So are there obstacles, either technical or legal or institutional or whatever, that might preclude similar risk-based approaches being adopted in other countries. And the project's been developed through a series of workshops and reports. It's an 18-month-long project due to end in about 6 months' time. Next slide, please. And some of the key issues or challenges that the project's looking to address are concerns in a number of countries that have merged that they're not in the same fortunate position as the UK is in, and they feel that they have very limited survey data. They don't have any long time series of data that they can pull together to carry out the kind of environmental risk assessment that was undertaken in Scotland. So looking at how best to address that challenge. There are a range of methodological details around how best to combine sensitivities and score those sensitivities. And the criteria used by the SDM policy are being revised and updated. For example, some of the technologies are new and weren't considered under the original SDM policy. And project scale, the workshops is a clear recommendation that we move away from a metric of megawatts and consider the spatial and temporal risks associated with project scale. So what time scale will the project be operational over, and what number of devices will the project have if the key concern is collision risk, or what will the project area's footprint be if the key concern is the effects of displacement. And of course, the other issue that, as I alluded to at the start of my talk, the SDM policy hasn't actually addressed is how best to integrate post-consent monitoring into the whole process as well. So the RICOR project is seeking to make recommendations in that aspect also. And this slide is just really to make the point, I think, that if you go to the Scottish Government's website, you can download the SDM policy and read it for yourselves. But what you'll notice is that it's got draft stamped across it, and that's been the case ever since it was first put there, I think over 5 years ago. It's still a draft policy, and it's quite likely that it will be updated at some point in the future, and it's quite likely that any update will be informed by some of the work I've just been talking about. So a little bit turning our attention now to post-consent monitoring issues. I've decided to introduce this term DRIP, a drippy approach I used in the context of how much data are needed for pre-consent decision-making. For post-consent studies, drippy data is, in my opinion, a really important issue as well. And that's exemplified, I'd suggest, by the offshore wind industry in the UK, which has spent a lot of money gathering data without necessarily considering whether or not the study designs would have sufficient statistical power to detect meaningful change. So these are underpowered studies, which I believe are good examples of drippy data and perhaps aren't as useful as they could have been. And as that report by the Marine Management Organisation, an English-based organisation, which is worth a look if you're interested in that aspect. So really, if you want to turn off the drip and gather data that is really meaningful, you obviously, you need to take an adaptive management approach. You need to have very clear research questions that you can confidently answer by gathering the data you collect, and that you believe will help improve future decision making. You need to be very clear about the spatial and temporal scales that you're interested in. You need to be identifying tolerance thresholds of change and the levels of confidence that you feel you need to have. And you also want to have clear procedures for managing the research and for including stakeholders. Approaches like having regional advisory groups and the utility of demonstration projects might provide point a way forward that can involve academics, industry, NGOs, and government advisors working together. I've put the ICES logo on this slide because of work being done by an ICES working group, the working group on marine benthos and renewable energy development, WGM BRED, I think they're called, and they're looking in some detail at this issue, and I hope they'll have a peer-reviewed paper on it, which will help to move discussions forward, I believe. Okay, next slide, please. So, the survey, deploy, monitor, and adaptive management. Okay, so to try and think about whether SDM policy is adaptive management or not, I thought, because obviously I believe some of the issues I've been talking about will resonate with, adaptive management practitioners. But is it adaptive management? And one of the first thoughts that struck me is that there is often some confusion about the definition of adaptive management plan. And I don't know if this is a contentious view or not, but my view is that an adaptive management plan has to reduce scientific uncertainty, whereas a mitigation plan has to reduce impact, and the two are not necessarily the same. A mitigation plan may form part of an adaptive management plan, but there's no prior assumption in my mind, at least, that that will definitely be the case. And indeed, especially in scenarios such as in the UK, where we take a precautionary approach to modelling the effects, it might be more realistic to consider that the adaptive element would be to tolerate more of the activity, not to require mitigation, or to require the relaxation or allow the relaxation of mitigation already in place. So I just thought I'd throw that perspective in at this stage. Next slide, please. So the technical guidance says that if you can answer all 9 of these questions in the affirmative, then the problem that we've got might be one that's suitable for adaptive management. And if you run down the list, well, my quick conclusion is that the survey deploy monitor policy, all it's doing is partially answering question 6, and only in relation to pre-consent monitoring requirements, not in relation to post-consent monitoring requirements. Some of the other questions, such as question 9, apply equally to the survey deploy monitor policy. It obviously couldn't be adopted if it didn't have an appropriate legal framework, but essentially it could maybe be described as a stepping stone that will enable a complete coherent adaptive management approach, but it isn't on its own an adaptive management approach. And I've just tried to illustrate that point in this slide. So this is, again, just taking the feedback loop of learning that's provided in the technical guidance and just providing some commentary against some of the bubbles. And, so the SDN policy, is relevant early on in the process, before the regulator has made their decision about the acceptability of the project. Once the project's approved, it will then be implemented. And then really the focus of attention under adaptive management will move towards designing post-consent monitoring studies, which should really be led by questions, in my opinion, that relate to key scientific uncertainties in the modelling done to inform the environmental assessment that flowed out of the design phase bubble. And once those post-consent monitoring uncertainties have answers, and that might take a considerable amount of time, as other speakers have mentioned, it's not necessarily cheap or quick to do, we should have reduced scientific uncertainty, more confidence in some of the ways we're using environmental models to look at the effects and the consequences on the environment. And that will lead to the adjustment, and my point here again is just to reiterate that the adjustment might well be to allow, and one would hope it would be to allow more activity, tolerate more activity rather than to require mitigation in some way. So that's really the framework in which I see adaptive management being applied in the UK, although the term adaptive management isn't necessarily always used or often used to describe that process. So I'll just say that seen in that context, I'd say the SKM policy, all it is an enabling stepping stone in an adaptive management road. It allows some projects to proceed at suitable locations and at suitable scales to enable monitoring of effects to then be undertaken. It's risk-based, but the Scottish Government believed it to be proportionate and certainly to be less tricky than alternatives considered. It's today still a draft policy which is likely to be further refined in the future. We can say it has enabled decision-making to happen in Scotland and for it to happen over reduced timescales. And we can also say that it has allowed the focus of attention to progress to perhaps the more important questions around how to reduce the scientific uncertainty with the effect mechanisms, having deployed devices. And there are, I'd suggest, remaining barriers with respect to reducing those uncertainties, and those aren't easily addressed, especially by small-scale projects. And they're probably best addressed through collaborative approaches such as demonstration projects of the type that we have at Maygen, if we're going to have sufficient confidence to move forward in the standards of environmental assessment that we do in the future. Okay, I think, yeah, that's pretty much the end of the talk, actually. So that's just some of the reports and references that I mentioned during the talk, and the final slide, if you jump onto that, it's just the end slide. So that's it. Thanks very much for your time.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Finley. It's a very interesting perspective from the UK and Scottish perspective for adaptive management. We are a little over on time, so I don't want to ask too many questions. One specific question for you, Finley, is does the scoring system you mentioned for seabirds for sensitivity provide any particular weight to protected marine mammals and fish?
Yeah, so each environmental factor had to be scored and a weight given, and so the experts involved in the process had to decide which of those factors to weight more heavily than others, and it tended to be some of the seabird species and some of the marine mammal species that got weighted most heavily. I think that's, yeah, if that answers your question.
Okay, great. Well, I would like to thank the presenters for their excellent presentations today, and thank you all for participating in today's webinar. As always, a recording of this presentation will be posted on TETHIS in the webinars page. The next Annex 4 environmental webinar is planned for after the COE conference in February, and we'll discuss the recent developments around collision risk and tidal turbines. And just for those of you who are passed on information about this webinar, and if you'd like to join the mailing list, please send a blank email to that email address right there. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all once again and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon or morning. Thank you.